welcome everybody to our discussion today of what's wrong with education. This is an episode recording for our podcast, What's Wrong With by Sauer. And today we will have some type of a diagnostic conversation about the current landscape of the field of education, and then discuss a little bit around potential solutions or current solutions that can enable a better future in the field. I'm Pinar, I'm partner at Sauer. I'll be moderating the conversation today and asking a lot of questions to this fantastic panel. I'm joined by Lisa, Maggie, Brian, and Ryan. And I know we had kind of like promotional chaos on this yesterday because Instagram was down, but this is a live episode recording in case anybody wants to drop in some questions, come in and out during the session. So if I see anything in Q&A, I'll address those yours later and maybe in the last 10 minutes. So welcome everybody. I will ask the panel to go around and introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your work and what you're working on these days as well. So I'll start with Lisa, and Lisa, please feel free to pass it on to the next.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Can't wait to discuss this important topic. My name is Lisa Lev. I am one of the co-founders and CMO of a company called Tenoshi. It's an educational company. And, you know, our whole mission is to make sure all kids have equal opportunity and have the right tools for success, for their future success. And so we launched a product. It's an all-in-one platform, the Tenoshi 2-in-1 computer with preloaded content. We launched it back in 2018. So we are a startup, and we've built some traction. We were on Shark Tank in 2020. And yeah, so again, just providing, making sure all kids have the educational tools needed for success. That's our mission.
And I guess Maggie.
Hello, I'm Maggie Grout. I'm the founder and CEO of a nonprofit called Thinking Huts, and we seek to leverage 3D printing technology to build schools where infrastructure is needed. And then currently we're planning to build our first 3D printed school in Madagascar, hopefully at the end of this year. And then I can pass it off to Brian.
Hello, my name is Brian Alexander. I'm a futurist specializing in the future of higher education. I do that in part from Georgetown University, where I'm a senior scholar and where I teach some classes in a graduate program. I publish books, I make media, I give a lot of interviews, and I try to hold conversations about where higher education might be going. My current book project, which is headed to the publisher, is called Universities on Fire, and it looks at global higher education in the age of the climate crisis. And I guess this lets me give it over to Ryan.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I'm Ryan Derby Talbot. I'm a mathematician and a teacher at heart, and for over a decade have been involved in innovative higher education institutions. I've been the chief academic officer at two institutions, one called Quest University Canada, another called Fulbright University Vietnam. Both of them are international innovative approaches to a liberal arts education, trying to think about education for the 21st century without departments, without the traditional strictures that we've had of traditional universities. I'm currently the dean of the college at Deep Springs College, which happens to be a small college and a working ranch that students labor at alongside their studies. So I'm very interested in the question of how we take advantage of human engagement, student engagement, and the student side of learning, and really think about that as a direction for the future as we contemplate all these difficult questions going forward. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. So we have a very big topic today in a very small amount of time compared to it. So I'm going to jump right in. So all of you kind of have a new way of approach, a solution or a solution to a problem that you've seen in the field. So let's talk about the problems in the field. And all of you will have your own breadth of knowledge from your own expertise and maybe things you're also observing. So would love to kind of have an assessment of what is going on today that is not working, and mainly so what are the underlying reasons of those happening? So whoever wants to go first.
I'll go first. So it's Lisa, and our problem in education, it's not really a new problem per se, especially when it comes to underserved and underrepresented communities. I grew up with an educator. My mom taught for 50 years in Los Angeles Unified School District, and I guess I kind of fell into this through her. But even growing up, I mean, she taught in South Central and definitely saw the inequities in the education system there, as I grew up, and, not having the resources, right? So, not having the resources is definitely a challenge, but it's not really a new problem. It's existed for years. And so that's really the problem that we saw, and that's why we developed what we developed, which is it's an affordable computer. It's an all-in-one computer where we preload content, and it works offline as well as online. So, during the pandemic, of course, the issue, especially in underrepresented communities, was the fact that not all kids had computers, right? And it was two problems. It was the device, not having the device, and also not having internet connection. And so what our computer does, again, they can work offline. So they can do their homework offline. So that sort of solves that issue. But yeah, like I said, it's not really a new problem. We've done kids coding workshops. I'm here in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. We go to lower income areas, and we do kids coding workshops. Those kids, I'll be lucky if in a class of 20, a couple of students might have a computer at home. Whereas we also do kids coding workshops in Silicon Valley, where the parents are engineers and they're learning Java, the same age group. So you definitely see the inequities, and that the problem really exists.
Yeah, and the earlier this inequity starts, the harder the chances that those kids actually catch up over time, because that gap keeps continuing to grow. And as you said, it's nothing that we didn't know, but last year was like a very clear picture of how bad it is. And
yeah, definitely an eye-opener.
Yeah, when the libraries are gone, when there's no Wi-Fi from McDonald's, all of these things that were actually used for as educational tools suddenly disappeared. And if anything, it kind of widened the gap. So there is definitely a major concern here. And I love, the approach is both on affordability of the device as well as availability regardless of Wi-Fi. So yeah, who wants to add in on that?
I can go next. I would say my perspective is more from the developing world. I think there are greater disparities there. I think what we saw is that while we were able to transition to online learning here in the US and other areas similar to it, in Madagascar, for instance, people do not have access to the internet, and there is already a lack of classrooms due to overcrowding, and a lot of students have to walk over 5 miles to the nearest school. So from my perspective, the greatest barrier there would be the lack of infrastructure. So that's where we would be coming in to find a way for technology to be a synergistic solution where you're still involving the communities, but you're leveraging it to then build more schools in less time and try to fill that gap more quickly.
Yeah, definitely. And you've also probably similarly, the pandemic have sort of amplified the infrastructure need, especially in the developing countries too, right? We've worked with some, I guess, higher education schools in abroad, and we often see, like, when we try to have an ideation session or even a meeting, like everybody would need to accumulate in one room because that room has the best Wi-Fi. So there's no option of like people joining in from anywhere, everywhere they want, and we're welcoming everybody's like ideas on it, but like really, how do we even connect first? So yeah, I think that is definitely something that both is, we still see it in developing countries, especially US, but definitely the gap becomes even bigger when we look at developing countries.
Well, I'm happy to jump in next. Since Pinar, since you evoked higher education, I'm happy to talk about that. One of the great problems we have worldwide, but in particular in the US, is the question of affordability. That is, we have published tuition and fees going higher and higher. We have the American way of treating that, which is with financialization and loans, which has resulted in an enormous amount of student debt, something like $1.7 trillion right now. There's a great deal of dread and anxiety about that, a sense that college and universities are now too expensive to access for people. And we have an additional problem, which is that our financial aid and financial support systems really don't work very well anymore. They don't account for a lot of students who are either first generation or who are supporting their families even before COVID. And of course, COVID made this worse. Now, there are a few ways to address this that are out there. None have been fully implemented, but I'll just share them really quickly. One is the idea to have a state funding for tuition. And some have done this on the community college level for individual American states. There has been calls for doing this at the federal level, at least for community colleges, if not for public universities in general. There's also been a lot of great work by people like Sarah Goldberg-Reb, who have been urging campuses to more fully account for the financial stress that students are under, to offer things like food banks, or to consider wraparound or 360-degree support that can really account for the realities that students face. There's also talk about perhaps debt forgiveness. The Biden administration has, well, to put it kindly, been waffling on this issue. We don't know if there'll be anything for that. There's actually a game show out there on cable TV where the winner gets their student debts paid off. But beyond that, it's still really an open question and very much a crisis for higher education.
Ryan, anything you want to add on the field of higher education?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate everything Brian just said. And what I might highlight is, in addition to the problems that higher education faces, I think my greatest concern is about what I would see is challenges for innovating or changes that can be made to higher education. Higher education is a remarkably conservative industry. And so universities and colleges have looked the same now for 200 years, more or less. And there are small innovations on those models, but overall, there's somewhat of a resistance to change or problems with that. And I'll just cite a couple of things that I think about and worry about. One of them is an idea I found in this paper called Competition and Reform in Higher Ed by a historian named Michael Pack. And the idea is that if you look in the business world, you see all kinds of businesses going into all kinds of different niches, trying on all kinds of different models, looking all kinds of different ways. There's a great diversity of institutions. But if you look to higher education, what you commonly see is a convergence of everybody trying to reach the same model. And the reason for that idea is that because the principle of competition in higher education is based on prestige. And so the idea is that because everyone is so concerned about reputation, which is a very hard to define thing anyway, everyone tries to copy the institutions that are on top of that prestige ranking. Basically, the highest ranking institutions become what everyone tries to look like. And what incentive do those high ranking institutions then have to look any different? They don't. They want to maintain their identity there. And any other institution trying to compete in that environment is basically trying to conform to the standards that are set by those high ranking institutions. So in some ways, prestige really locks down higher education into trying to keep a model in place that's reinforced by those at the top of the rankings. And that serves as a significant barrier to change. Another barrier, of course, has to do with specialization. The fact that higher education has really made its organizing principles to be around fields of specialization. But what we see in the modern age is that problems are actually highly complex, intertwined, interdisciplinary. And thinking needs more than disciplinary specialization. It certainly needs that, but it needs something more lateral, something more cooperative, something more team-based. And it needs students who are able to enter into those kinds of problems in a way that goes beyond just a disciplinary training. So I think that overcoming challenges of prestige and specialization are a couple of the problems that higher education will face in helping students meet the challenges of the day and of the future.
I completely agree with that. This is a major issue. And one thing we have to keep in mind is that when we say higher education, it's an incredibly diverse institutional field. With many different strata and levels. So we have, for example, in the United States, the enormous community college sector, which is only like 40% of higher ed, which is incredibly affordable and incredibly accessible. But we don't often give it a lot of talk because it's open enrollment in effect. We pay a lot more attention to the other extreme. We pay more attention to the Stanfords and the Harvards, which have a vanishingly small number of students, but an enormous amount of media clout. I'm sorry, Pinar, I didn't mean to trample on you.
No, definitely. I was just like very passionately agreeing with you. And I like that ties into what Ryan was talking about, the prestige, right? The more you compete for that prestige, the more you're actually diluting the conversation of what type of educational model is best for everybody. And it's also, you talked about resistance, Ryan, and I do want to touch upon this for all of you, because all of you are kind of having an unconventional way of thinking to the current process or tools or infrastructure, right? So that resistance, what I understand more on like the curriculum level, maybe it's because of standardization or the things that we just, were comfortable doing for so many years, right? We had specializations, and why don't we continue specializations? Like growing out of that maybe takes time, but maybe also that like benchmarking with each other, like who's performing best, like kind of that prestige wars, maybe that, and that you mentioned that sort of like might be some of the resistance. But does anybody want to add to that? Why is there resistance? Why is it slow to push for changes, where in some fields, I like, for me, like an analogy now for this field is like the healthcare, right? Like, even though there's so many innovations within the field, the service itself, the changes in the innovation there is like very slow, and affordability also is a big problem there. So while some industries can see like fast changes, why do we see this resistance a lot in the field of education?
I'll start with just an observation, and then I'm interested actually to hear from the others on this. It used to be that universities and schools were the storehouses of content and knowledge, and they're where you had to go when you sought out that knowledge. They're just, where else would you go? There wasn't access to it. And so in some sense, there's an allegiance to content and knowledge that has shaped universities and schools. And what's interesting, I think, is that over the past few decades, what we've realized is that the learning process has a whole lot more to do with the person learning than just the content and knowledge. And I mean, we've just now started talking about, it's become common discourse to talk about biases, cognitive biases that people have, and about blind spots that people can have, and different ways that learning can be accentuated by and facilitated by experience and engagement. So in some sense, I feel like our model of education is still based on this idea of shepherding over the distribution of content, rather than thinking more broadly about how individuals can engage more meaningfully in learning experiences. And I think that question is really stimulating and relates to the larger question of how we can enhance access and innovate and modernize educational systems. Anyway, those are just my thoughts, but I'm curious for those, for others, to hear from others.
That's actually interesting, Ryan, that you said that. So you're talking about more personalized education, right? Is that kind of what you're
yeah, I think I'm trying to back up from the question of like education should be a teacher telling students knowledge. I'm trying to back up from that question and think about, what is it if it's not just knowledge? What is the relationship? What does the learner need? How do we really facilitate that learning now that that knowledge is much more ubiquitous and accessible?
Right. Yeah, I guess I was just thinking along the lines of just like personalization and even technology, right? Back to your question about, why doesn't education change? I mean, I just think I don't really know why education doesn't change. It's just can't teach an old dog new tricks kind of thing. I don't know, but but I know as technology advances, one of the things that we're definitely looking into with our devices and specifically is personalization, right? Content that's more personalized for that particular individual. So, artificial intelligence, AI, built into our content. So, and I think that to me also is the issue, right? With education, it's more of, everyone's put into this box, and not everyone learns the same way or at the same pace as others. And then I just think we need to sort of customize learning more, and that would be through technology, which is one thing that we're trying to do as well. But as far as, again, education, I don't know why education is so slow, but we're here to change it, so, which is a good thing.
But it ties to, like, both of your responses tie in with each other in terms of, like, if we do not treat it as like centers for distribution of content, but more like how people might learn, what is the best ways for them to learn, and how does this stick with them and ultimately become of great use, right? So there we have the importance of personalization, and probably being educated with that mindset also helps changing fields anyway, right? So we need more of that open thinking, even though it's like changes might be seen in generations. But Maggie, you also, I mean, we don't see 3D printed schools all around the world. So what is your, like, when you're trying to talk about the idea, what type of resistance, if any, like, you come across? Like, what is the skepticism around it?
I think that because it's so new, people just don't understand the concept and how it can be applied to construction on a larger scale. But I also think it comes down to maintaining power. So local, I guess the traditional way of construction, people just don't want a disruptive force coming in, even if it may be a better solution to how to do things. And then I also think about other bureaucratic ways of how it could just maybe, I guess, affect us advancing, especially having graduated from university this year. I saw that administration was definitely a hindrance. So I do wonder, Ryan and Brian, your thoughts on that from higher education as well.
Yeah, maintain power struggles, right? And that is probably applies in early childhood education and like higher education, that power struggles and the sort of like the reluctance for like change, because that means all dynamics might change and who makes money might change and who's ruling might change, like all of that. Definitely, the more multifaceted the problem is, obviously the harder to get the solution to. But also, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this. So like when we are trying to come up with a new way, that involves a lot of prototyping, right? And there's failure in prototyping and we iterate and we go about that. And when we're talking about a very rigid system of education, like, hey, this is elementary school, junior high, high school, college, okay, you're done. So like when we have such certainty and a very solid framework around what education means, then even for students, it might be perceived risky to prototype on your own education, right? Like, oh, I'm going to take this class or program that has never been tried before, and I'm graduating next year. Like, should I really do that, right? So, I'm like curious to hear your thoughts on like the need for like new solutions comes with some like trial and error, but when our education and what we mean by education is so definitive, I could see not only on the administrative side, but on the student side, it can be scary too to try on something new, because then what am I going to put on my resume? What's going to go on my CV? What am I going to say to employer? Like all of that concern. So how should we then rethink the boundaries of what education means? What are your thoughts on that?
I think we need to show students that maybe it's not necessary to conform to what is expected of us, because I think a lot of times you're prepared to follow this 10-year plan, but life just never does actually follow it. And because we're raising children to think that way, I think that also prevents them from building companies that could change the world too, because they think they need to climb the corporate ladder for stability.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think, we have to think too of like, what is the end goal? Why do students attend college, right? It's to get a good job, right? So, and to ultimately make a decent salary. So I think it's sort of twofold. Like, we can't just blame education, but we have to blame like the corporate world too, because I think they put, these boundaries and these just, what is it called? Just, I don't know, regulations or thoughts into our ideas, or thoughts on, what they want as far as an employee. And so then that, falls back on the student and thinking, oh, well, I've got to take this course and I've got to get these credits and I've got to go to this college. Right. Because these corporations are only going to accept me from this college, and that's where I want to work. And, so, I think it's kind of twofold.
I think that's great. I would just point to in the chat, Inank Ire, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, asked what this is in terms of students fitting in or standing out, which I think is a very, very important question. I was just going to add one possible wild card, which is looking at how we respond to climate change. Because on the one hand, the entire education system from kindergarten through postgraduate, among other things, prepares students for a life in the world which can either generally be impacted by climate change. So there's a kind of call for general climate awareness, but also they might work in fields that are precisely about that, such as, for example, electrical engineering in order to work on solar panel construction, or civil engineering to work on seawalls, or sociology or poli-sci in order to work on how we change our civilization. There's also the fact that physically all of our schools, again, from elementary schools to universities, will have to change depending on where they are. So if you have a school that's in, say, well, Istanbul or in New York City, there's the excellent chance of being clobbered by sea level rise and by floods. If you're in, say, for example, Spain or in the American Southwest, there's a chance of being hit by desertification. So then there's the entire change as well about resourcing one's electrical power to get away from oil, coal, and gas. So we wonder how many schools will have, for example, their own solar power panels or their own wind turbine or their own geothermal. And then on the research side, there's the fact that so much academic research actually grapples with climate change. You think about fields like hydrology or meteorology, but also, again, psychology, as people try to prepare and understand what it means to grow up in a world that's physically different. Lisa, you're in the Bay Area, right?
Yes.
I mean, thinking about how that changes as the sea levels rise, and as the temperature increases, and as wildlife and as flora change. How does that? I mean, the San Francisco that you remember from 1 year becomes something very different down the road. Psychologists and sociologists are trying to study how humans respond. So I think the entire education system confronts climate change, and that gives us, among other things, a lot of threats, but also a lot of opportunities for us to respond creatively. I don't mean to hog the mic. I'd love to hear from everybody else.
I'll just chime in with Pinar. Your question about risk, I think, is a really good one, because an irony here is that risk is really what's required for learning. You have to be willing to step out of what you know and be vulnerable to, be open to finding something you don't know, learning, right? And interestingly, risk isn't something that is celebrated certainly not in higher education as much. There's such an emphasis on correct knowledge that stepping, taking risks is something that it can feel like there's too much at stake and that you're going to fail if you don't have the right answer. So it tends to be sort of more conformist. And an interesting experiment that we tried at Fulbright University, Vietnam, when that university started, is the year before launch of the undergraduate program, we brought in 50 students pre-admitted to work with the founding faculty and engage in a year of design thinking style activities to develop the curriculum. And that was such an interesting experience because it was inviting the students to participate in some way as a co-designer in a curriculum. And of course, they don't have all this expertise and background knowledge, et cetera, but they do have their experience, and empowering them to provide their feedback and engagement with these questions that are central to education was actually an incredibly enriching learning experience for the faculty, as they were actually sort of testing out assumptions about education live in the mix. Now, that co-design year was sort of like a startup project writ large, and that there were experiments that were tried. There were things that seemed like good ideas that turned out to be bad ideas. But the point was that there was a learning and an adaptation process that really affected people and changed them in a way. And one of the things we struggled with is, how do we assess what has happened here? Because traditional assessment is based on these, how much technical knowledge in a field did you gain? But what we were trying to measure was changes in skills and mindsets that students were exhibiting. And we had this framework of competencies to try and get at that. But that's one of the challenges, because when risk has this element of experimentation and even magic to it, that sometimes is hard to capture. And when pressured, it can feel like it's more easy to return back to the kind of status quo, because quite frankly, it's more comfortable.
Right. And
Lisa.
I was just going to say, and that just, as you were speaking, Ryan, I was just thinking, the pandemic, right? Is it unfortunate that, something major like the pandemic have to happen in order to change things, and for us to take that risk? It seems like, I don't know, maybe that's the case, because if it wasn't for the pandemic, I mean, yes, we were doing online learning, but it was definitely not to the extent that we had to, we were pushed into this, trying to figure it out, like in rapid speed, how to teach kids and students, virtually. And so it's, like I said, it's kind of unfortunate that, in order to take a risk, do we have to have something major, catastrophic to happen?
Exactly. Yeah, I think that like in that way, Ryan, your example is also a great example of how to mitigate the risk, because you're calling in students a year ahead, right? Like they're coming in earlier, co-building what they're going to learn together. So there's ownership in kind of like the syllabus, right? But also like there's a deeper understanding of why we're learning those things anyway in the first place, because so many of us graduated from school and like, I have no idea, I'm never going to use that knowledge again that I've learned in that class. So I'll just memorize it for the exam. But that builds a greater understanding and already is a kind of a setup to collaborate, think, build in resilience into what's coming ahead. So I think, and to your point too, Lisa, the broader the conversation we have, and I guess the more diverse and bigger the collaboration is when we're setting up things, I guess the better chances we have in successful outcomes, right? Like we don't have resilience built in so many of our industries really, and therefore we faced so many challenges last year. And to your point, Brian, when talking about climate change, we're only going to need teams that are working collaboratively from different disciplines that could kind of even ideate on solutions to like do anything against the climate crisis, and really to be able to build a resilient world. So there is like, I think, yes, like developing a a new way may come with risks, but if we kind of plan for it and start on with that, like if that's the first attempt, like how it wasn't that 1 year wasn't done during their undergrad program, it was done a year ahead. That kind of like planning could definitely create better outcomes when we face crises, I guess. I also want to add in and get your thoughts on, so we have all these mega problems in the world that younger generations have much more awareness on, and they actually feel that they want to and need to do something towards. So we have that drive already. So that definitely started to reflect in education and what fields they're going into, as you said, Brian, and maybe at what companies they want to work at and what type of like action they take in their day-to-day, whether it's like activism in consumption or really protesting on the streets. But also there's a component of life longevity, right? So we're not, well, hopefully most of us are not passing away in like the age of 50. And I think today's maybe 12-year-old or 14-year-old has an expected life of 104 years old. So if we graduated when we were like, what, 21, and maybe we do a graduate school too, so a couple years more to that, and we're done, and we have all these very complex problems in the world that we're facing that we need to work on, how is that even, like, how do we even ensure like we educate people anyway? So when we're talking about, I guess, the boundaries around what education means, what are your thoughts around when it comes to our increasing life longevity and how we need to have more and more adaptation to this fast-paced changing world?
Really quickly, I'll jump in. In a futurist business, we spend a lot of time with demographics because demographics tend to be baked into a society, and they really are pretty durable trends looking ahead. And one of them we know is that for almost all of the developed world, and for more and more of the developing world, that your point about getting older is very, very important, that our societies are aging up. We're also, in part because we're living longer, but also because we're producing fewer children. And so one side effect of that is that education systems that are geared at, say, kids aged 5 to 22, that has to change. And already worldwide, we have a lot of adult learners and a lot of schools that are pointed in different degrees of efficacy at adult learners. But I think we need to do more and more of that. In particular, something I've been calling for is for taking more seriously the education of elders and retirees, people over 65, because that's a growing population that have a lot of reasons to study, partly because they want to study something their whole lives, never had the chance, partly because they may be afraid of cognitive decline, partly afraid of boredom, partly just from passion. And it's a wonderful population to teach that, like any different segment of the population, has its own needs, its own challenges. And I think we can do more and more of that. What brings us back to me for primary and secondary education is that lets us think about multi-general education, where we could bring elders back to the community. For the almost 20 years, we lived on top of a mountain in Vermont in a very, very remote spot, which had very intensely community-based education. And one of the things the elementary school did was it often had grandparents and grandfriends events where the kids, and again, K through 6, would get to meet with people who were 60 on up. And it was a great, great experience in terms of learning about the environment, learning about history, and so on. So I think just opening our aperture to really account for the full changing nature of the human population, I think would be very, very smart.
I love that intergenerational learning. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Pinar. The old way of thinking is this idea that we grow until we're age 20 and then it's stable from there. And so that paradigm suggests that we should pick an area of specialization to target and invest ourselves in it, and then revel in our expertise in it. But the way the world is looking right now, I mean, it's no longer those single lines. And so there's more of this portfolio mindset that's needed. I mean, even people are defining their careers in this kind of way of thinking about them as portfolios of projects. less about being, an expert in a single thing. And that's not to say there isn't value in that expertise, just that there's a need to think about that as a broader diversity. And interestingly, I think one thing that's interesting to me is continuing education has largely been technical, in the sense of when we think of continuing education for someone in their field, what we're talking about is like an update to the technical knowledge and skills in a field. But what is so rich about education is these great questions. And imagine some of the courses that undergraduates have the great privilege of taking that contemplate grand questions in life and really think about these interesting problems and come up against ideas that people haven't encountered. It's wonderful to take up those kinds of questions with adults. And indeed, I have had the privilege of teaching brief adult courses where you can get really rich engagement. And one of my secret desires, which I sort of share with very few people, is I love the idea of reverse sabbaticals. And what you have in universities is that you have every 7 years, professors take sabbaticals where they leave their job in academia and go do research or exploration or, have some other experience to enrich themselves. I wish the general public did that in reverse. So every 7 years, people could go back to university or into school, and really take advantage of educational opportunities, because we do continue to learn and to grow. And it's just having that kind of mentality that life is continued opportunity for learning. And I don't just mean technical opportunities for technical training, but really rich engagement and conversations, just like the one we're having on this together in this session. Anyway, that's one of my secret dreams. But I think that, that's something I'm excited about. Anyway, I think you really put your finger on an important part of the question here.
Do you say, oh, go ahead, Lisa.
I was just going to say, that's good. When I graduated from college, I cried because I didn't want to go into the corporate world. I could be like a full-time student forever if I could, but because of our system, it just doesn't work that way, right? Yeah. And I've always said, for society to say, hey, you've got to pick a degree at the age of 18 and, go to college and, and do whatever you majored in college for the rest of your life. I just think that that's so unrealistic now. We're evolving. I mean, who I was, when I was 20, I'm like completely different. I've learned more, I know my knowledge base is more. I like you said, Ryan, I mean, I think, we're continuing, if we could have that opportunity to go back to college, like every 5 years or 7 years, and learn, based on, just our experiences, I think that would be extraordinary.
I want to expand the conversation of what going back could mean. I recently attended a panel that talked about the metaverse and how it might actually make education or experimentation or science more accessible to developing countries, communities that don't necessarily have an access to, let's say, a science lab, which is an exciting prospect. And then you're kind of thinking, oh, maybe it does bring access to larger communities, age groups, like if it makes going back also easy, right? And then it also makes me think of all this digital gap, infrastructural gap that exists in many countries and cities. And do we also then have a risk of the gap further growing with more things offered on like the metaverse, and only people who are very digitally savvy can enter those? Or if you're in a developing country and don't have enough like infrastructure, let's say, for connectivity, you're already out. Like, it's an exciting, new thing that could definitely bring further access, but also might push out people more too. And what are your thoughts on that?
I would say that I think it's influenced a lot by socioeconomic factors, especially tying it back to risk. So especially if you're like a first-time generation student, you're probably going to go in trying to do a non-risky path because you want to have a cushion and make sure that you have that stability moving beyond in life. But if you do come from a more privileged background, you may be allowed more opportunities in that sense. You do have a cushion to fall back on. And I think a lot of times we are influenced by the access to opportunities or the lack of in both of those, the developing and developed countries. And I think that's what we'll probably face here. And back to what you were saying for this specifically, I think that we'll see a widening gap because of that.
That's such a good point. Go ahead, Lisa.
I was just going to say, I guess I think about, okay, so why is the gap going to wide, right? So we'll be able to fit. And that's
Lisa, can you repeat that again? You froze for a second.
Oh, I'm sorry. It says my internet connection is unstable right now. Can you hear me?
There you go.
Okay,
yeah, we do.
Now, I was just saying that, I think you have to kind of think about, okay, why will the gap widen? And for me, I think it's going to be because a major problem is going to be just money and folks not being able to afford the education. And so with that, okay, so then how do we solve that, right? And I think it was Ryan, you were talking about like community colleges earlier. And that's kind of what I think about is, these universities, especially this prestigious universities are going to be hecka expensive. But then we've got to like open our eyes and and there's this, I think, stigma, with community colleges and that they're not as good or, inferior. And because I had that sort of mindset, right? When I graduated from high school, it was, why are you, people are going to would look at me at like, why am I going to a community college as opposed to a university? And so I think they just have that bad stigma. And so, but I think, we have to kind of somehow get over that, right? Because community colleges can, and like I said, I mean, not everyone learns the same way. So community colleges could be a great educational experience for a lot of folks. And that's how you can afford education.
Yeah, and if anything, maybe they can adapt the education, like the curriculum or syllabus more towards the community needs, right? I feel like they would have actually a better chance of that sort of personalization or adapting those. And also, when we're talking about problems like climate change, we kind of need all hands on deck type of situation, right? So we can't necessarily the people who are going to go to Harvard are going to solve our problems. It really doesn't work that way. It does require everybody's collaboration on it almost. And I think to your point, Lisa, then like we really need to sort of like undo the societal stigma, but also the corporate stigmas that you mentioned, right? If you're only seeking people that are Ivy League graduates to hire, then we have a big problem. And this also then sort of not only widens the gap on like, when we have a wider gap in like education, then this starts trickling down into wider gap in the representation or really having diversity in corporate settings, or even like people who can really be a huge value add with their life experiences. We kind of sort of eliminate that out in the corporate world. So it kind of all goes hand in hand. And I encourage everybody to, if you have any questions, this is the time to start dropping in. I'll try to address them if you do. But I guess one big last question I do have is, we touched upon affordability a lot, right? And it ties to everything that you're all doing for sure. But we also do know we can't get there without public-private collaboration, right? It does take effort on the private side, and also definitely we need support on the governmental level. Can Can you sort of like maybe break that out or give out examples of how that public-private collaboration might look like?
Sure, I can throw in a few. I mean, we can start at the micro level, and we think about how local companies and also local nonprofits can was on all levels. And that may be supplying materials, it may be supplying work examples. I was just learning about a great project in Rhode Island where they were siting offshore wind turbines and then connecting K through 12 schools so that the kids could visit them, see what they're like, but also learn about them and everything that's involved with them, and then turn that to adult learners who can then be trained on working on those turbines, for example. We can scale this up to municipal governments who definitely have an interest, and then higher to state and then to province or department or county level. And then beyond that to the national level where we may have nations that have interest in this. I'm talking to you from right next to Washington, D.C. right now, where they're trying to grind this gigantic mess of an infrastructure bill or bills. It may be that some money comes out of that, which will let people partner with schools in order to do some work. There can also be the transnational arrangements where you think about transnational groups like the European Union, or you think about UNESCO, or you think about different treaty organizations, including, say, water agreements. There's a very long-standing treaty between the United States and Mexico, for example, to handle water that flows between those two countries. And all of those are potential organizations to partner with and support. Those are a few ideas.
Excellent. Anybody else?
The only thing I would add to what Brian said is that there's been a trend of divestment in public education since the 1980s. And, and I think that in some sense that's suggested that that education is, I think there's a way in which we haven't been thinking about the value that education really brings in a large sense. And really thinking about different ways of investing in education. I mean, I even think of, interestingly, some of the Silicon Valley companies are doing their own kind of educational programs for their employees, bringing in people to give talks. Google is known for that, for example, and trying to enrich the educational opportunities. So in some sense, I think there's some recognition, especially in entrepreneurial circles, of really the value of kind of seeding educational experiences. But what we need is a large, I guess I'm a bit of an idealist here, but really for me, education is one of the most important things that we can put our time and resources into. And I just noticed that it's there's been a less of a financial commitment to that that we've been dealing with for decades.
Yeah, I definitely. I mean, with both Lisa's and Maggie's case, where there's newer ideas and ways of implementation, right? Which both need funding. And in Maggie's case, it's in a nonprofit form. And in Lisa's case, it's startup, right? So how do you see sort of like the funding available in the scene needs to change? Both, I think it's very interesting as like on a startup perspective, as well as a nonprofit perspective.
Well, I'll just speak for, startups. I mean, definitely because of the pandemic, we saw increased funding in the ed tech space. However, I'll just say, for what we're doing, which is hardware, it's very hard to get funding. So we've had a lot of challenges for us personally, as a startup. And then to also, just because I'm a Black woman, less than 1% of funding has gone to Black women. So that's another.
Even though we see so much entrepreneurship from Black women, by the way, it's not that, there aren't Black women out there who's trying to innovate. Right. I think it's like the biggest population today to be like entrepreneurial since COVID.
It's definitely increased Black women founders. But yeah, we're still not getting the support
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, it's very, very challenging. You know, we're going overseas, we're doing a lot of stuff different. You have to
Yeah.
be creative.
Yeah. Going back to the resistance, I guess, and how
Yeah.
things like the mindsets need to change to open up
Right.
ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So
Maggie, do you want to add anything to that quickly? And then I can address the questions.
From the nonprofit perspective, I would say it's also challenging with funding, probably more so because there's no monetary ROI, even though if you could help millions of people, a lot of times people want to see a return. So that would be a big challenge. I would say the biggest improvements we could face is if more corporates would help fund nonprofits, because there's a ton of money there, but I think they do keep it locked away for very few projects, and then lots of red tape to even get the approval for funding. And I think we've seen in the pandemic, the technology companies are making billions of dollars compared to other people. So they definitely have the funds available to support people making changes that are really needed.
And I think this ties very well to the prestige we talked about. You know, the big funding and partnerships doesn't necessarily have to happen with like the big nonprofits, but there are innovative nonprofits out there that really try to change things too. So I think we definitely have a need of a sort of small team or a startup collaboration with corporations more and more, as well as public funding and all of that. I do want to address, I guess our time is running up, but there's one interesting question around evaluation. So if we change up things, how do we change up evaluation? And evaluation, currently how evaluation takes place is like one of the problems of the field too. So if I guess one of you, if you can like pick up on that question.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it very briefly. It's a
Sure.
huge topic in education, and I'm sure any one of us could spend a long time talking about it. This is what I think also makes innovation hard, is that it's very hard to evaluate learning because it's so different, highly nonlinear, so long-term over time it unfolds. How do you tell what a good learning experience is? And usually what happens is we all reduce to the common denominator of, was something said and repeated back, and sort of saying that is what we can qualify as a learning experience. But the way that at least I've been trying to think about it is with different approaches in the different projects I've been involved in, is to try and expand the question of what are we evaluating, and, you know, not just content, but skills and mindsets, and how do we measure those things? And can we look at, you know, time one and time two experiences of students and figure out ways of measuring bigger capacities, and also relaxing a bit on the question so that people can take risks and try things, so that the evaluations kind of follow as ways of determining if our experiments are making sense, but not as hurdles that experiments themselves have to answer before they've even had a chance to try something out.
That's great. Both, like, I guess we need that change in the administrative level to not force that upon teachers, and then teachers to also really, I guess, personalize the evaluation and approach it with a new way if they have the agency to do so, I guess. So it ties in both, like, hand in hand with the administration. Okay, we have 2 minutes, and I want to do a rapid fire of advice from all of you for anyone who is trying to push boundaries, make some change, make progress, whatever, however we want to frame it. What would be your 15-second advice to them?
I'll just say, you know, advice, if you want to make change, you know, you just push forward, persevere. You know, you're going to get a lot of naysayers, but follow your passion.
Yep. Next.
I'm happy to go next. There are more people trying things than I realized. And, you know, the current place I'm at, Deep Springs College, has been going for 100 years, and it's a working ranch, and the students do self-governance, and it's a totally different kind of place. But there are lots of experiments happening, and I think that connecting with others who are willing to try new things can be really helpful. And there's more experiments out there than than you may think. So I think I'm encouraged by the risk taking that I'm seeing possible, and hopefully reinforcing as we go forward.
I love that. Maggie?
I would say if it was easy, then everybody would be doing it. So whatever work you're doing is really important to complete.
That is very true. Brian?
I'd say for academics that they have to listen hard to the younger generation of students whose experience is extraordinary and very important, and they should welcome such students to co-create the future of higher education. For those students themselves, say that the rest of the 21st century is yours. Please make it with passion and with your imagination. Don't be weighed down by everything we're telling you.
I love all of these: co-creation, passion, taking risks, exposure, and really just pushing through it. Thank you everyone so much. This was such a treat. This episode will be live soon for everybody anyway, so we will definitely be sharing the links when it's live. But thank you so much for making the time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Teachers Day too, so this is appropriate.
Yeah.
To involve you.
Exactly. Thank
Thank
you
you.
everyone.
Bye.
So